kind of the default thing that happens with Windows, right? Or with PowerPoint. But let's this at least gives me a blank canvas upon which to talk about Unit 2, Presentation 01, where we will talk about Module C here. In Module C, we will talk about planning out these pen testing engagements that we're going to spend so much time talking about for the next little bit. That's a big part of it, but also the negotiation piece of it, how to figure out navigating the business landscape that is involved in this when hacking became a business, and then how you might want to budget that out and do the planning for it. So when you're sitting down and figuring out all of this craziness, these are the questions you want to, oops, darn it, you want to discuss with the person who doesn't hit Alt F4 on accident while they're trying to present in PowerPoint. So you want to know, what are we doing here? Are we just ticking a box for the PCI DSS compliance piece? Which is fine. Legitimate use of company time and funds. You know, you've got compliance issues. If you are a large enough organization, you need to do that. What the scope looks like? Anybody know, other than being a delightful breath freshener, what scope's all about?
What you're actually allowed to touch or not touch in a test to make sure that you're not, like we talked about last week, hitting something that you shouldn't be hitting during, business hours, stuff like that.
Yeah. What is in scope and what is out of scope? What things can we work on? And you can time box that as well as like just yes or no to individual devices. And then the rest of the stuff. What kind of documentation can we expect? What kind of information do we need in order to effectively do this? Are we going to be doing this on a regular basis? Who will be involved on both sides? So what are the names of the people involved? What do the rules of engagement look like? We'll touch on those later. How do we handle that communication I was talking about? And then what constraints are placed on us? So if you are, if you don't spend a lot of time in the business world, some of these initialisms and acronyms here might be new to you, like a statement of work, or sometimes also you can find scope of work documents out there that are basically like, here's our timeline, here's what we'll be delivering to you at the end of this process. And those will vary from organization to organization of how those are laid out. So, if Jim's firm has a template that they roll out for that kind of thing. MSA, or a master service agreement, would be like what we settled on in terms of this project. So doesn't necessarily have to lay out exactly what it is that's going on, but basically who's going to own intellectual property, how are we going to pay for stuff. Frequently you will find like a clause that says we will be agreeing to like binding arbitration as opposed to going to court if there's any kind of dispute, and agreeing to that up front as opposed to going to court. You'll see MOUs in a lot of contexts in business, but memorandum of understanding are basically like, these are the things that we agree to in terms of this deal. You'll also see letters of intent kind of used in that same space. They're not necessarily legally binding, although they can come in handy should you find yourself in a situation where you are fighting it out in court. Hey, we had an MOU that spelled out this, that, and the other thing. And like if it is, we had an MOU that said we would be pen testing on this day and that day, that will come in super useful. We have a union at the college, a faculty association. We have MOUs about like parking. We have MOUs for everything. So it's not just a pen test thing. It is all kinds of stuff. You'll see performance work statements. So basically, um, or a statement of work sometimes that is specific to what it is we're going to be delivering in terms of the work, what it is we're going to be doing. We're going to start with we're going to start with an open source intelligence gathering exercise. We're going to progress into a vulnerability analysis on the network. We're going to take that vulnerability analysis and then we're going to do attempted exploits on any weakness that we find, blah, 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 blah. You'll see a lot of that, particularly in government work. And you will also see things like statement of objectives that are like what it is we're trying to get done here um, when we write that out. You may have heard of service level agreements from like networking courses where, service providers agree to provide 5 nines of uptime to folks. Um, they can say things like, what are we going to guarantee you in terms of your data security, or what are we going to promise you in terms of how we're going to treat your network while we're on it, all that sort of stuff. Operational level agreements are like supporting documents for an SLA, but like if you're working for a big giant organization that serves other organizations, that'll become a bigger deal where you have to say things like, in order to do this, we're going to keep the following going in order to like make sure we don't screw up your customers. And then you're probably familiar with non-disclosure agreements, basically that say, in a pen test, they say things like, if you come across any of our intellectual property, you won't disclose it. You're not going to disclose any of the details of our networks to your other clients. You're not going to provide any of the stuff you learn about our internal workings. You're not going to let that out. So you're agreeing to not tell anybody what's going on inside of the network, right? But you don't want to broadcast that stuff. So that's kind of the what we're setting up in terms of business contracts when the pen test gets signed up for. In the process of like asking for a pen test, depending on your organization, if you're representing, Joe Company, you probably got some sort of procurement set up so that you've got a process in place for how you get stuff. And a pen test is stuff as far as a business is concerned. So you may put out feelers, and those are sort of like preliminary, sort of what it is we want to know about, like your services. So we'd like information about, the Zach and Tyler Pen Test Inc. and what it is you guys do for stuff. That might turn later into a request for proposal where you ask, okay, we think we know what we've got. We're requesting that you give us a price tag on what it is that you're going to charge us in order to do this pen test. And the idea is that it's solid enough that you could come up with a bid based on it, but probably the pen test company knows best about what services they offer. So it should be also flexible enough that it lets somebody go in and say, okay, do you really want a full board pen test at this point, or are you really more looking for a vulnerability assessment? And so that's what we're quoting you, because we don't think you're really ready to ride the ride of a full-on vulnerability assessment. Or AppSec testing on your OWA instance. Microsoft's probably got that dialed in. Maybe you don't want to do that. And then an RFQ generally means we've got very specific requirements. So if you know like what it is exactly that you want, those tend to be more hardware based. Like I know I want 6905 Cisco switches, and this part number and this this specific set of daughter cards that are going to be installed into that. So requests for quotes tend to be really, really, really detailed and not, as wiggly as RFP might be. So this is why you guys got like the pen testing class, right? Learn about requests for comments and requests for proposals and requests for quotations.
Yeah, clearly that's the most exciting part.
It is.
Yep, that's it. This is all I'm here for right here.
Excellent.
Yeah, we can just skip the rest of the class.
All right. So, environmental restrictions don't just mean you're not allowed to dump, gasoline into the river. We're talking about like things that are limitations of the place where you're doing business. So sometimes, depending on where you're at, things like having a set of lockpicks means that if you don't have licensure, you will be arrested and guilty of a crime just by virtue of having those handy.
Yep.
And then, does anybody know the status in West Michigan if you're walking around?
Yes.
And did you find this out the hard way, or?
No, I did this. I figured it out before I ran the risk of getting caught with them, which is that technically they're fine. They're in a weird sort of gray area in that they can be considered burglary tools, but only if they can either prove that you use them as such or that you intend to use them as such.
Yeah,
Otherwise, they're not.
Proving intent is hard.
Yeah, exactly. So if I say I'm going to use them to do that, then yes, they would consider burglary tools, and then I would get in trouble.
I intend to break into a building
This
with
is
these.
like, just say, this is what I use because I have ADD, so I just fidget with this. Just have a
You'd
little
like
like
to-
training lock with you, so
Or
this
it's
is how I keep my hands busy.
Or you can say that you use them in case you get locked out of your house, because that's perfectly reasonable.
There you go. I keep them in my car, right
As
next
long
to.
as you get permission to use them from somebody else, there's nothing wrong with having them.
I remember there's one of the guys at the lockpick little
Village.
section at GerCon.
Yeah.
The village. I think I remember hearing one of them saying, he's like, yeah, I haven't had my house key in like 3 years now. I just use one of my picks to get in.
There you go.
I've done that a few times, yeah.
I'd want a better lock than that on my house.
Oh yeah. There's times where you start to realize that it's like one of my dad's houses. He tried to lock me out as a joke, and we learned that the locks on that house are scarily easy to open.
In
So
the handful of times I've ever had to get into a building that I wasn't supposed to be into, but I was allowed to get into, I've never needed to pick a lock. I have always been able to get in windows
have you guys
or
ever
doors or what have you.
seen the lockpicking lawyer on YouTube?
Yep.
Watching his videos has made me realize just how insecure the majority of the locks are.
Oh yeah.
Because most of them he gets in like under 30 seconds. Even supposedly like really secure ones.
Well, this brings us back to that sort of.
It's not actually
This brings us back to like that defense in depth approach. The lock might suck, but the camera that's recording you while you pick it works really good.
This is true. This is true.
And now the cameras are like $100 on the outside for your networks, or for to plug into a wireless network or something. Only so useful. So those are the other provisos they give you about those sorts of things. Going to Ohio, I don't know if that puts you into legal danger at that point with your lockpicking tools. Just mailing them someplace might get you into trouble. If
I think I don't think it was Ohio, Indiana maybe.
I have to drive back and forth to Indiana. Purdue's in there somewhere, so like occasionally I need to be in Indiana. And then like there's 100 darknet diaries about the rest of this stuff. Like when you get the wrong address, or you break into the wrong floor of the courthouse, or the person who finds you out doesn't know what happens. So that's where those get out of jail free cards come in handy. But I mean, only so handy, right? Your get out of jail free card can only give you authorization to be in some place that the person authorizing you is, legally allowed to do. So if you're breaking into somebody else's building, but you have authorization from somebody who's in no way connected to that organization, your life can get interesting fast. So there's due diligence that needs to happen on both sides of that equation. As a pen tester, you need to make sure that somebody's done the homework and found out that you're not breaking into the wrong floor of a building. So speaking of get out of jail free cards, you want, and this is these are on our Pen Test Plus exam. You want to make sure you are explicitly allowed, in no uncertain terms, to do what it is you are doing, because absent this authorization, you are basically just committing crimes. You're basically just violating the law. So once you get into the penetration testing part of the thing, even the vulnerability assessment, if you're, going around providing free vulnerability assessment to Wi-Fi networks that are, near your home, you're breaking the law. Once you start talking to them. So make sure that your authorization is watertight and maybe airtight, maybe electrically tight. So make sure that make sure they actually have the authority to let you do the things that you are supposed to be doing there.
At what point does it technically become illegal, especially for something that is on the internet, such as like a web server that's, made to actually receive connections from anyone? At what point does that technically become illegal?
I am not a lawyer. Some of it's got to do with intent. Some of it's got to do with, I think generally speaking, you're pretty safe, like up to where Shodan is.
Okay.
Right? Did we talked about punk.io, Punk Spider?
I don't think we did.
No, there was like a Shodan knockoff done by a company called Hyperion Gray that was like, let's do all the things Shodan does, do an Nmap scan of a target, except next, let's run exploits against those things. So I think that's where you cross the line.
Are they still around?
Nope. Sure aren't.
Big
Sure,
surprise
I think they were DoD funded too. So yeah, Google me up on that one. Punk.io, punk.sh, something like that. Yeah, they're gone. I was at a presentation with them though. My daughter still has a Hyperion Gray t-shirt I got from that conference. It's got hacker stuff on it. So communication is the key. This is true of relationships of all kinds, but especially true of the relationship between the client and the pen tester in question. You want to make sure that you are frequently able to plan out what it is that's going to happen and answer all of these questions when figuring out what it is we're going to do. So what are we doing in terms of communication? This is like a problem you run into all over the place. Do you guys write your emails like they're long form letters? Dear recipient, comma, new line. I'm writing in regards to blah, 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 paragraph, blah, 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 paragraph. Sincerely, Tyler Russell. Sincerely, Zach Goble.
I mean, yeah, that's usually how I email.
Yeah. Never did I ever do that in business. I did not start doing that until I started at the college. And somebody actually like did one of those take you aside and give you a gentle piece of advice kind of moments. And said to me, your emails read very harsh because you don't put that nonsense in there. And I was very much of like you'll meet, there's a great book called Because Internet that talks about how people, the mores and interactions people have based on where they like got on the internet bus. And for people who got on the bus in my generation, at the time I did, like that's considered redundant. Like there's a to field in an email, right? It's got your name in it, so I don't need to say dear name in to field. there is. So I struggle with that level of formality piece myself outside of the scope of this. So you too, while dealing with your interactions with the nice folks you'll be working with, might find that to happen. So these days, I err on the side of formality and try and do the dear sir or madam. Like to my eye, coming from an engineering background, that always just looked like somebody trying to sell me something. Like if you have to type "Dear Mr. Rosenmeyer" or whatever, somebody's trying to make a sale. But they're clients, and I guess you are trying to make a sale. It's nice to be paid for your work. Other things to keep in mind, what does that person know about what's going on with the pen test? If it turns out that it's news to them that there's a pen test in progress, that's a bad day for you. Who are you talking to, and where are they in the organization? Definitely sir or madam, the CEOs or the VPs or the CIOs. If you're talking to an engineer, what I try to do these days is match my level of formality to the level of formality that I get. So I am delighted and surprised when somebody just sends me an email that just starts, with what it is they want to talk about, as opposed to dear blah. And then how can you keep that communication clear? Because what you don't want to wind up with is some kind of confusion on what is going on with what is basically a sanctioned attack on an organization. So you need to make sure that is crystal clear, that people understand exactly what is going on there. You want zero confusion around that. You want to make sure that if it says you can begin DDoSing the email server at 3, that they mean 3 a.m., right? You don't want any question about, did you mean 3 a.m. or 3 p.m.? So, all right, so that's all the fun stuff related to setting up the initial engagement planning process and all the exciting business documents and business advice we can give you, all of which the nice folks who put together the Pen Test Plus thought were very important. Questions or other experiences related to that? All right, so we've got the paperwork done. So next up, we probably should start figuring out what it is we're actually going to do. Now that we've got the scope of the engagement worked out, we've got all the legal business put down on paper, we've got get out of jail free cards that we can use moving forward. Now it's time to get down to the business of figuring out what's going on now, what kind of test is going to help them, how much money the customer is willing to dedicate to it. Kind of a very critical question right there. And then if there are technical constraints, what are they? How do we need to be aware of them? All that good stuff. So step one, how much y'all going to pay me? Putting it like that to the client might be not great. But the client knows what scope they would like to have assessed. Right? They define that when we were talking about the planning process for these engagements. Maybe now we need to make sure we don't experience what is called scope creep, where you give me one engagement constraint that potentially could grow and grow and grow and grow. Well, obviously, if you're going to test the sales server, you probably should be testing the clients too. You want to make sure that that is all spelled out in boring and exquisite detail. How deep we're going to go is basically if we're looking for a long, in-depth analysis of our systems, do you want us to try and write ODAs for your Windows clients? Or do you figure the old, HD Moore's Law? Have you guys ever heard of Moore's Law? The processors are going to double every, 18 months, I think. Yeah.
like that, although it doesn't really hold true anymore.
Right. Well, we were running up against Intel becoming a failing company that's not managing to do very much these days, and
Thermodynamics.
yeah, the unfortunate fact that like things don't really want to vibrate much more than 5,000 times a second if they're made of metal, which is kind of a bummer. But it's why you don't see a lot of CPU clocks that run faster than 5 gigs. The HD Moore. Anybody know who that guy is? You've probably heard of his tools if you're taking a pen testing class. You could Google fast. Give you a hint. He wrote a tool that's installed in Kali Linux.
Metasploit.
Yeah.
Thought I'd heard of it.
Yeah, HD Moore writes Metasploit. And so like the HD Moore's law is you need to be like not vulnerable to Metasploit before you start worrying about the rest of that nonsense. So when we're talking about depth, like, do you really want our engineers writing fuzzers to reverse engineer the binaries that run your application if any script kiddie with a copy of Metasploit can pop your servers because you haven't patched them in a month? It's probably more important to learn that instead of going deep and digging into like the code your company writes and all that kind of fun stuff. And then, can we assign a junior pen tester who's been on a handful of engagements and is perfectly capable of doing that sort of HD Moore law level of assessment? Or do you need somebody a little higher up who's not going to use as many automated tools, who's going to have experience doing this? And, are you willing to pay for that level of experience as you go along? And then extras on top of stuff, assistance with vulnerability remediation, some sort of like social engineering component that we're going to toss in along with it. Are we going to do this? Are we going to add a phishing test to go along with your penetration test? Would you like us to start from like, usually this is where that white box, black box conversation starts to happen. Do you want us to have to scan and analyze your network for you before we start? Or would you rather not have to pay for that work and just give us your network documentation ahead of time? So anything beyond that? Are we going to buy a enterprise level Wi-Fi pineapple to deploy in your environment? That kind of stuff. You're probably not going to be handed just a blank check to go out and do, all the things that sound really fun and would be awesome to do. But there's only so many dollars. There's a great story in, there's a book called Shop Class as Soulcraft, which talks about our relationship with technology. And oftentimes, people who are really into engineering or hacking or computer science or whatever want to make things right from the perspective of the technology. And the example he uses to illustrate this is he's working on a motorcycle and it's got this oil leak that after 10 years caused a component in the motorcycle to fail. So oil dripped on this thing for 10 years, and after 10 years, the component that it was dripping on failed, and the oil was burning off as it was failing. So it's not like it was a problem for those 10 years, but it did eventually make this component fail. Not a particularly dangerous component, just made like the motorcycle noisy. And to get to that leak and to repair that leak involved disassembling the entire motorcycle. So we face this question in technology all the time. I could replace the component that broke and he'll be fine for 10 years and it'll cost him $50. Or I could fix the real problem, which is the leak, by disassembling the motorcycle and getting to the place where this leak occurs and fixing that and then reassembling it. But that's going to cost my client 8 hours of my time to completely disassemble and reassemble a motorcycle in order to fix a leak that's going to break apart every 10 years. So we run into those things all over the place with our rules of engagement. I think that's what I was trying to get to with that. I just love that story. The more I can tell that story, the better I feel. But I think what I'm getting to back there is budget, right? So they've, as technologists, we want to fix the business problem. As engineers, we want to fix the motorcycle problem. But as a component of a organization, as a part of a business, what really matters isn't the leaky oil. What matters is the motorcycle runs right, and it'll run right for 10 years for the price of replacing the broken component, as opposed to fixing the root problem. So like, we want to fix the root problem, which is going to be expensive, whereas what the business might want is just freaking replace the component, give me my motorcycle back, and I'm out of here. That was long-winded, huh? So what are the rules of engagement? I guess that's rhetorical. It's going to depend on every different engagement, but they will define what the scope of the engagement is. What is a win for us in this pen test? Does it need to be that we compromise the Active Directory domain controller and have control over the entire network? Is it good enough to get into a single system on the network? Are you going to give us that toehold to begin with? What's allowed and what's not allowed? Am I allowed to use buffer overflows that might knock down servers and keep the business out of business for a while? Am I allowed to be noisy in my scanning? When am I allowed to do my pen testing? I told you about that class where I had a guy who runs the blue team for a hospital as a one TA and a guy who's a pen tester as another TA. And the pen tester was talking about how great his job was. And the guy who works at the hospital was like, yeah, but you know what? I get to go home at 5 most days, and every pen tester we've ever hired gets to start testing at 1 in the morning. So, I mean, there are some quality of life trade-offs in the various jobs out there. What are we willing? What kind of risk are we willing to accept in terms of the tools that the pen tests are going to be using? Like, are we willing to let people break stuff? We talked about the white box, black box, double blind piece last time. You know, are we going to give them a head start? Are we going to? There's something to be said for double blind or even half blind, where you probably are paying for a lot of extra pen tester time if you do a black box test, right? You're basically paying for them to do the work your network administrators should have already done, document the network, come up with a list of systems on the network, all the stuff that can be gathered through OSINT. So white box tends to be more economical. Double blind, where the pen testers don't know about the network and the blue team doesn't know they're coming, or half blind, where you like give the pen testers documentation but you don't let the blue team know they're coming, are all part of the various rules of engagement that we're looking at. And then what it is we're going to do with all of that juicy data that these folks are coming up with while they are doing the pen test, and what they might stumble onto while doing the pen test. So if you find something while you're in there, what are you going to do with it? And then how are the teams going to talk? You know, are we going to have a daily, weekly, hourly, bi-hourly status update between the pen testers and the blue team? Are they going to talk at all? Is the blue team in the dark? You know, if we're doing a blind pen test and they don't know we're there, so what we're really going to do is talk to the business representative who is taking the lead on the project on the regular. How's that going to work? That's what we're talking about when we're scoping out rules of engagement. What is it that we are testing specifically? Are we just trying to see if we can get into the network or not? Are we doing a physical pen test? These days, I guess that's not a big deal because most people's businesses are basically just locked up at this point. But when it's not the midst of the coronavirus, you know, are we having people pick our locks and sneak past our cameras and try and tailgate their way into our buildings or not? Or is it just logical? Are we going to ship you guys a computer and you're going to plug that computer into your network and we'll tell you what's going on? When do we start and finish? Does it begin on Monday at 10 and run till the following Monday at noon or whatever? based on what color the box is and whether or not we can see, who should know what and how before we get started. Ideally, if like it's a physical pen test, somebody on site should be aware of it. Otherwise, you get into these situations where like people show up and wind up in jail. So if at all possible, that's a good idea. Again, techniques that are in scope and out. If you really do want us to do a penetration test, it is going to potentially involve breaking stuff. So you can't really say, we can't do any exploits. If they're asking for stress testing from a stressor service, what's the one? XYZ something? XYZ stressor. It's not like you can ask for a DDoS assessment and not get a little bit of DDoS on you. XYZ booter is what they're called, I think. Yeah. So like these are allegedly legitimate services that you can sign up for, that if you have a friend on a Minecraft server you want to knock off. These guys will sell you lots of bandwidth to go through and pound on systems. If you're asking to have your network stress test, it's going to stress test your network. It's a thing. How are we going to secure data? How are we going to make sure that stuff doesn't walk out the door? And then again, communication's key. So we're going to go and give that feedback back to whoever the lead from the target organization is as we go along. So, rules of engagement. There's plenty to them.
Speaking of like stress testing, have you guys seen the amount of data that CloudFront can handle for like their DDoS protection?
Oh yeah, a lot.
It's so hard to fathom because I saw like one of the biggest ones in the last couple of years that they've handled is in the like terabytes per second bandwidth.
When I'm talking DDoS with students, I like to bring up the Brian Krebs attack. And I'm pretty sure that was the Mirai botnet that fired off on him. And what was the total here? 363 Gbps. And he used Akamai as your only real defense against a real distributed denial of service attack like the Mirai botnet coming down on you is Cloudflare, Akamai, one of the protectors.
Yeah, I mean, as soon as that hits your like external part of your network, if you don't have something like that on it protecting you, you're screwed.
Right, and I always kind of chuckle when I hear vendors talking about like we sell DDoS protection equipment, right? Like so you're back here on your network and you've got their DDoS equipment installed out here, and this is your connection to your ISP. And you've got what? You're buying big bandwidth. You've got like 1 gigabit per second here. When you're hit with a 10 gigabit per second connection, I don't care what's there. You're done. Like you've got nothing that's going to stand up to that. So what you do is you buy multiple connections, and you have whatever this is, probably a website mirrored across the internet. But if you hear a vendor say, I've got this box, and there are blinking blue lights on the front of it, and it protects you from denial of service attacks, certainly not distributed denial of service attacks. Denial of service attacks, can it protect me from like the IPv6 vulnerability that Microsoft had a while ago? Sure. I buy that. Can it protect me from some kid running a botnet that just took over a bunch of cameras using default login names to flood me with reflected traffic from poorly configured NTP servers? Maybe you can't do that. So depending on what type of pen test we're talking about, some of this stuff might become very useful. So like documentation of your network's going to be good, architectural diagrams if we're talking about a physical pen test, how things are configured, if that documentation is available would be great. This stuff starts to get more into the AppSec land, where if you want if we're testing your API, the documentation for the API might be useful. If we're testing your server, how it sends out various communication info over XML or WSDL or WADL or XDS or whatever alphabet soup of basically JavaScript objects that get piped over the internet as ASCII characters, we probably want to know how those work. If you've got a software development kit for whatever product it is we're looking at, which will probably also contain a bunch of APIs and XML documentation for that sort of stuff, we want that. And ideally, if you really want your app tested properly, having example code come in very helpful. So if any of those things that you can ask for ahead of time, some of this stuff, again, this is the difference between white box and black box, but that stuff we'll get to eventually, right? If you're a pen testing crew worth your salt, you will, if they say a black box test, when you're done, you should be able to provide a lot of this stuff. I mean, maybe not architectural diagrams, but certainly pretty good drawings of the building, good video of the building, stuff you got from Google Maps. In terms of documentation for the network, you'll certainly be able to provide IP addresses and open ports on those IP addresses and the services running on those open ports on IP addresses, and versions for those services if it's at all possible. You'll reverse engineer the APIs or the SDKs eventually. So why not just hand that over and save everybody a bunch of hassle and save yourself some money on the back end. So there you have it. Then we can, after we've got our support documents, we've figured out what the rules of engagement look like based on the budget, based on our initial analysis, and we've worked out how we're going to be talking to each other, and we've got all these business documents and legal documents worked out. Now we can kind of level set what it is that the organization should be expecting out of this test. They should know how they are going to be delivered. They should understand that this is basically a snapshot of where you are right now, and it doesn't have any judgment on where you were 6 months ago or where you should be in 6 months. We potentially miss things in pen tests. We would tend to focus on one or two vulnerabilities in order to establish a foothold. There might be more. We can point you in the direction of the things we found there, but can't be guaranteed that we've tested them all, unless you want to pay us to, in which case. So these are a way to figure out how we can improve our security posture, and hopefully they're delivered in that spirit as opposed to being taken as some big condemnation of the organization. Everybody should know that, we've got NDAs. We are not going to be discussing these things, and they will be protected as defined in those NDAs. So all of our stuff will be encrypted at rest. All of our stuff will be encrypted in transit. We're not going to leave your data lying around where somebody else might stumble across it. So, sometimes crazy things happen during an engagement. We're at least going to be understanding about how we're going to communicate that stuff. So the example that comes up a lot is, what if while we're pen testing, we come across indicators of compromise or live connections to other people, who've already broken into your network? What do we do then? So we need to have answers to all of those questions before we get into it.
So this might be more of for a lawyer kind of question, but generally speaking with NDAs, is there kind of a general line that you can't cross there as far as being able to talk to a client and say, yes, I've seen it with a client before that uses software and this network stack that we've seen these common vulnerabilities and stuff, because you're not specifically naming a client, but still being able to say like some of the things that you've run into before.
Oh, for sure. Like normally that's cool, and definitely that is a question for a lawyer in specific. But generally speaking, there's a lot of like I I have seen this sort of thing with previous clients. Right? Is totally vague enough not to get you in any trouble. Now, if you say, oh, when I was checking out Sony, they used the following firewall with this configuration. No, you've crossed the line. So yeah, so that
Gotcha.
line's pretty bright.
Okay.
But I've seen other clients with this vulnerability before. This is a common misconfiguration error. Is usually fine. And like oftentimes, what protects you in those situations is that you'll have seen whatever it is you're talking about in the public press. So like if it's something that anybody could look up on, the Register or Yahoo News or whatever, then yeah, you're fine to talk about it, especially in those broad, vague terms. Most of the NDAs I sign are like for people's curriculum. So like I will say things as specific as, and again, don't take legal advice from a cybersecurity nerd. I will say things like in other curriculum, I've seen it where they, because I've seen it in more than one curriculum for the most part. I see it all over the place. Actually, the last NDA somebody asked me to sign, I told them no. I said, you can pay me to do this, or I can sign that NDA, or have me sign that NDA, but I'm not going to do that if you want me to sign that. They want to be bad enough that they said, okay, just use your best judgment. And I was like, fine, I will. All right, you ready for some pop quiz? Don't everybody chime in at once, Tyler.
Yep.
All right, we've got several security assessments for the same client, different personnel, locations, and types of work, but there's a single contract that governs payment terms and dispute resolutions with that client. What letter of alphabet soup are we talking about here? It's like we've got one master agreement that covers all of them.
Is it B?
Yeah,
Master Service Agreement.
the MSA, right? Yeah. All right. How about which of the following are you likely to find in a SOW? What was a SOW again?
Statement of work.
Work, right. Rather than in some other supporting document. Choose all that apply. What are we likely to find in a statement of work that wouldn't be in a different document? So non-binding statement of mutual goals, engagement timeline, intellectual property ownership for custom developed testing tools, penalties for disclosure of proprietary information, or project deliverables.
A, maybe?
B as well.
I'm with you on B.
So, choose all that apply, yeah.
Yeah. So an engagement timeline. What else might be in a statement of work?
Maybe E?
I like E as well. Those are the ones we were looking for. Non-binding statement of mutual goals. Which one would that have been? Scroll back through the alphabet soup. We had a non-disclosure agreement. Probably not. Operational level agreement. Probably not. Service level agreement. Probably not. Maybe we would slip that into a letter of memo rather of understanding if it's non-binding, just kind of a guideline.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I can believe that.
Good. Belief is what we're after here.
Yep.
What else we got?
I believe.
The following is true. Which of the following is true? Regardless of where your penetration test is taking place, choose the best response. So valid license is needed to carry lockpicks. Written authorization as a pen tester from the facilities manager will shield you from liability from any physical intrusion. You no longer need to worry about mailing your toolkit to the testing location, or you should have explicit written authorization from the owner of the system being tested. No matter, what was it? No matter where your pen test takes place.
D.
I think.
D for sure.
Definitely D.
All right, too easy. You're writing a testing agreement for a new client. Which of the following is not an example of comprehensiveness disclaimer? Choose the best response. Any future changes in the network status will change the validity of the test results. Well, more complete results require broader and deeper tests. Since the test has a black box methodology, testers may reasonably miss significant vulnerabilities by circumstance. Unknown risks won't be reliably measured in the test results. Which of the following is not an example of a comprehensiveness disclaimer? So another way to look at this question, and like we're doing these because like answering questions will help you pass this test. What would be disclaimers about the comprehensiveness of our tests?
C is definitely a disclaimer for
All right.
that.
That's what I was thinking too.
Okay,
C.
So C's, and the question is which is not. So we decided C is a disclaimer. Oops, don't look at that. We decided C is a disclaimer. What other ones? Now that you have absolutely no idea.
Well, I was gonna say B also is a disclaimer, basically
Uh-huh.
saying that if you want more, then you need a broader test.
All right.
He's talked about unknown risks can't be reliably measured, which would also be a disclaimer.
I think that's true.
Oh, look at that! Only A is left.
Man, you guys are good. You guys are killing it. All right, how about this? You're preparing a whitebot test. The client sends you waddle files that need to go with your existing documentation. Since the message wasn't entirely clear, you have to guess which target they go with. Which of the following does it best match? WADL files. I think this is one of the.
Remember what WADL stood for.
Yeah, like you needed to read very carefully the previous chapter if you wanted to get there. I believe I saw this
So-
in.
Waddle is web application description language.
Okay, so far so good.
Okay.
They describe a blank web service. All of those are web services. A blank type of
so
web service.
I'm gonna guess D. Web services would most likely be in XML.
True. You have to guess which system they go through. Google WADL real quick. That was a good guess.
Flash.
Thank you.
Oh.
Just
D.
What are we going with?
Rest.
Oh, that's the key. It is in the text if you go back through and read it. It is a RESTful inventory application that does this web application, blah, blah, blah. All right. So that's that. I'm going to stop the recording for this one, and we'll come back and do the next one next time.